That, my friends, is a little soundbite from a couple weeks ago as I had occasion to visit with and be at the Colorado Rapids road game against the Portland Timbers. Co-chaplains Ben Dudley and Troy Reedy were over the moon excited about scoring the first goal. At first blush, you might think Troy, who's absolutely giddy with delight, declares that the Lord has heard their chaplain prayers for a win. But in context, it's just part of the fun and banter that sometimes we chaplains in sport exchange. Well, if you don't know by now, I'm Rev Brad, and you're listening to the Soccer Chaplains United podcast, From the Touchline. Today on the podcast, I want to talk about superstition. Superstition is often around sport, and it's often around the work that we do as chaplains, and it's something and sometimes something we have to work against. So stay tuned. We talk about religion and faith and superstitions in soccer right after this.
He's found the space and he's found the back of the net.
Just a little off foot, thinking he's going to go far post. Not strong enough with his right hand.
Whips that one in. Far post, almost made him ends, and they have. He has the hat-trick. The second in his career. The third of the night. The hat-trick hero.
Talked about you're not going to be able to sustain that kind of pressure.
To the corner. Goes towards the near post. And you're the angle, and what a goal! What a goal!
As I've already shared, a couple weeks ago, I had the privilege of traveling with my club team, the Colorado Rapids, to Portland for the first road game of the season. We lost the match 4-1. In what might be described as a difficult game, we were down 3-0 after 30 minutes, not the way we wanted to start the league season. And of course, the Timbers chaplains, as you can hear, are absolutely delighted, while I was absolutely crushed. And, we're all at one level fans of the teams and the people that we serve. But one of the most difficult spaces that a chaplain can often find themselves in is within the superstitions that exist around the game and around sport. Now, let me distinguish a little bit of what I mean. Athletes, coaches, maybe even executives and staffers, at elite levels, whether soccer or another sport, they usually all have a level of discipline that they engage, especially the athletes. And this with an aim to perform at optimal levels. So I'm not talking about discipline. Discipline often transcends or it has multifaceted layers for many, if not all, aspects of the game. Let me talk what I mean, give a few examples. For example, there's one's diet or their sleep schedule. Someone might even have outside of the game hobbies that they do or don't do because it might interfere with their playing. All of these things are kind of habits of discipline. And these habits from time to time, sometimes they fall subject to a sense of superstition, but usually these are time-tested, proven characteristics that help an athlete to excel at performing and being his or her best. Now, aside from practices of discipline are habits and routines. And again, these are not necessarily performance related, but they could be associated or familiar for a rhythm that an athlete undertakes or even a manager or coach before a competitive match. Let me give an example. It could be that a soccer player puts the left shin guard on first, and then the left sock, and then the left boot. Or, maybe an athlete or a manager has a routine, taking a vacation in the off season to a particular part of the country or going back home. These habits and routines, again, can sometimes dip into an area of superstition, but not that often. There's a third kind of final aspect of this, and that's kind of flat out superstition. In this, maybe it's a player believes that they need to wear the same pair of socks without washing them because they've won their last 3 matches. Or a manager thinks they've worn a particular piece of clothing on the sidelines. Maybe they had a scarf wrapped or tied around their neck in a particular way. Maybe they ate eggs the morning of winning a big match, and so they think, I've got to keep doing this. It's giving me the mojo. It's helping us to win. Well, sometimes the chaplain becomes or falls victim to this kind of thinking. A team might experience or believe something like, well, hey, the chaplain traveled with us and we won the match. We should have the chaplain travel all the time. Or, in my case, the chaplain traveled with us and we lost the match poorly. Maybe the chaplain should never travel with us again. Or sometimes it's the chaplain prayed this prayer and we won the game. We should pray this prayer all the time. I remember the words of former Switchbacks FC chaplain Kurt Trempert. He used to tell his team, and he used to tell me too, if the chaplain takes credit for the wins, they have to take credit for the losses too. So here's the question. Is the chaplain a team's good luck charm? Does the chaplain somehow have this direct line connection to God, and thus the chaplain and God have some role or responsibility in securing a win for a team? Well, what happens when both teams have a chaplain? What happens when the other team doesn't have a chaplain and they win? Does that say something about the chaplain, the team, about God, or about something or somebody else? Well, there's a lot of rabbit trails that we might take in this conversation, too many for today's podcast. I want to reference a little book out there entitled, Does God Care Who Wins? It's written by a friend of mine, Bob Schindler, and there's other books like this out there too. The book wrestles with the question about whose side is God really on? And there are many other theologians and philosophers who are out there, and they're talking and sharing about these things and struggling and wrestling with the question about faith and its place in sport, and how faith and religion, these things intertwine or don't intertwine for that matter. So you can, of course, imagine there's a wide range of opinion and testimony and support for either side of the question. And athletes will often talk about God or their faith helping them. We see this in many of the interviews that happen. As a longtime chaplain in soccer, I too have had to wrestle with some of the theological and philosophical issues that come up from this. Does a chaplain pray for wins? Should a chaplain pray for wins? What happens when the team is a perennial loser? What then? What about the Christian teams, quote unquote, or the Christian, quote unquote, athletes that never seem to win? Where's God for them? Well, I've probably bit off a bit more than I can chew here in this podcast, but at least let me try to drill down a little bit and speak to the issue of superstition and how a chaplain ought to behave. Christian chaplains can learn a lot about handling superstition when we read and study the Apostle Paul. And he writes in his letters to his young protege and up-and-coming pastor, Timothy, and he writes to him and tells him about some of these things. So in his first letter, Paul lays out this desire and kind of even tells Timothy, look, I based you in Ephesus and I put you there to combat some of these people that are coming in and around the church, and they're teaching false doctrines and beliefs. Now, we know from today these teachers were Gnostics. They kind of taught that everything physical was bad and the spiritual was to be exalted and considered better or to be considered more. So Paul tells his young protege Timothy, he writes this, I urged you when I went into Macedonia, stay there in Ephesus, so that you may command certain men not to teach false doctrines any longer, nor to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies. These promote controversies rather than God's work, which is by faith. You can read that in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. In ancient times, one of the ways people would make money was by being an orator or a philosopher or religious teacher. They crafted wonderful stories. They often weaved and mixed elements of truth and religion and philosophy to help capture and captivate an audience. And this is often the way that they earned an income. They earned a wage, a living. These teachers, though, had infiltrated the church, and they began to devise stories based on the people and the narratives of the Old Testament, and they would twist these things into complex philosophies. Paul warns Timothy about these types of teachers and the type of learner that was attracted to what they essentially were peddling. And so Paul writes an important truth. Myths, or superstition in this case, and the enabling and fostering of this kind of thing just leads to controversy. There is more trouble and division that comes out of considering, following, believing in these myths. Think about it for a moment. Remember some of those situations I just said. What if two teams, any sport, pick it. What if two teams have two great Bible-believing Christian chaplains? And we both know they're both praying, they both love their people, they love God, and they share a message. Well, what happens when one of those teams wins? One of those teams loses? What happens in the event of in my case of soccer, a draw or a tie? Here's another scenario. What happens in a match if one team has a chaplain and one team doesn't? What about the team with the chaplain? What if they lose? What if they win? What does that say, again, about God, about the chaplain, about the team? And what if neither team has a chaplain? What then? What if, sometimes for a chaplain or for Christian people, there's these superstitions or myths that somehow God's going to bless one team over another because, well, there's more Christian athletes on that team, or maybe they do more in the community, and God's going to bless them over another. Well, those simply are wrong ideas. Those are myths. And we can have many different kind of versions of those kinds of beliefs or angles. And I think essentially what Paul is saying here to Timothy, you're just creating controversies. This doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help people in thinking about God. It doesn't promote God's work. God's work is really about moving and living and being by faith. So a good lesson, I believe, that we can learn here might be summed up this way. 1, we should be aware of myths and superstitions. Secondly, we should understand that, truthfully, these things undermine reality, they undermine faith, and they aren't really beneficial. Later on in the same letter, Paul gives Timothy a reinforced command. He says this, "Have nothing to do with godless myths and old wives' tales. Rather, train yourself to be godly. For physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise for the present life and the life to come." That's 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 7 through 8. Now, again, I don't have time in the pod to go too much into Gnosticism, but suffice it to say that the physical was denigrated for the sake of the spiritual, or at the expense of the spiritual. I'm curious, really, how Gnostics might feel about sport altogether because of the physicality of sport. Now, likely they might say that the only value of sport are the spiritual outcomes that might be produced. So, they might say, well, the spirit of teamwork is a good thing, or a virtue of courage. These are really the only good things that come out of a football match, a soccer game. So Paul, in this passage of Scripture, gives Timothy and us a good command, a good redirection. Number 1, don't get sucked into myth, superstition, legendary story. Secondly, train up to be godly. The idea is that godliness isn't some supernatural, ethereal thing for the next life. It actually holds promise and value now in the life that we're living here on earth. The godly trained football player, I think, can hold in balance and tension the idea of God blessing and ideas about prayer and faith without getting sucked into false beliefs or notions that might weaponize that faith and turn it, like so many other people that are so religiously bent in sport can be prone to do. I've shared this before in another podcast, but I had my own superstitions growing up about sport. My favorite American football team, the Denver Broncos, were several times in the Super Bowl, and several times, instead of being at home and watching the game on TV, I was at Sunday night church. And I recall myself thinking as a child, maybe I was 10, 11, 12, don't think about the game. Don't think about the Broncos, because if you do, then God will see you in church thinking about the Broncos rather than about him, and they will lose. Of course, in 1990, when the Broncos lost 55-10 to the 49ers, this superstition was just reinforced. I think I slipped up and I thought about the team just as we started singing the closing verse of the hymn, "Just As I Am." I mean, I joke. But Paul says, don't get caught up in that. Don't believe for a moment some myth that thinking about the Broncos in church is going to lead to the team's demise in the Super Bowl game. Well, Paul writes a second letter. He writes a follow-up to Timothy. In it, he shares that in the latter days, people will start to only put people around them that tell them what they want to hear. He says of them, they will, quote, turn their ears away from truth and turn aside to myths. But you, Timothy, keep your head in all situations, endure hardship, do the work of an evangelist, discharge all the duties of your ministry. That's in 2 Timothy 4, verse 4. Well, I take this to understand that we're not up for an easy time. Whether you're the pastor of a church, chaplain at a soccer club, or you're a worker standing around the water cooler at work, people will often just put yes people around them, people who merely agree, or they tell them the things that they want to hear. This could be a coach, an administrator, an executive, an athlete. It doesn't matter. They'll just have people surrounding them that say and do the things that are comfortable or easy. So as a chaplain in sport, I find that there's often a work I have to do to educate and train and teach right thinking about God. I have to teach people that praying to God and seeing success or victory shouldn't lead us to believing some false notion or creating some superstition in our life. There's a balance to be had. There's an understanding, a discernment about God and his plans and purposes that we ought to be seeking after. Now, does this mean that chaplains won't get into a little bit of banter, that we won't gloat a little bit when our team wins? No, there's some good fun that can happen amongst friends. But I think that we all have to know and hold on to the truths about God and about his word. We have to hold each other accountable to those things too. That's what I love my friend Kurt saying, as a chaplain, if we take credit for the wins, we also have to take credit for the losses too. We have to hold these things in balance, especially as our work as chaplains in sport. Even to the point that Paul, as he tells and writes Timothy in his second letter, discharge all the duties of your ministry. For me, this means I've come to a point of understanding that my words of blessing are not necessarily just for one team over another. My call, my role as a chaplain is to bless people, to remind God's people that he is for them. The badge on the kit or the uniform doesn't matter. The wins and losses come as a matter of God's purposes and plans and designs, which truthfully are higher and greater than my own little mind is even capable of understanding. My call is to simply be obedient and remind God's people who they are and to whom they belong. I recall a few years ago, I was praying with the visiting team athletes prior to a match here in Denver. Interestingly enough, it was the same club, the Portland Timbers. The game was a snowy affair. It saw both teams finish 3-3 in the coldest game ever recorded in Major League Soccer history to that point. When the Timber players returned home, they told the chaplains the following week, "We kind of felt like Rev Brad's prayer was amazing. It was like he was praying for us to win." Now, I don't know if that was necessarily true, but I share that story to say that as a chaplain, the best that I have to offer in terms of prayer or encouragement or support or love or care is, or something else, is really based on my role. And it's based on my responsibility to reflect Jesus, to represent God well to the people of soccer. And truthfully, it rarely matters what team they happen to be playing for on a particular day. Well, my friends, I hope that I've given you something considerable to consider in terms of your own track or ideas of superstition. There are habits that we can have. There are routines. There's disciplines that we can keep in our life. Do those things bring us a victory? Do they bring us success? No, they might make us a better athlete. They might make us more excellent at the work and the things that we do. Is it something that we need to consider that whether I pray or don't pray, that means God may or may not be on my side? No, that's getting into the realm and the depths of superstition. I do encourage people, we do need to find ways. There are ways to integrate our faith, our football, our family, all of these things. But we need to be careful in this area of superstition. And hopefully I've given you enough to consider today to think through these things wisely. Look at the letters that Paul writes to Timothy. Consider and think about his exhortations and encouragement to this young guy to not fall into a trap, to not get caught up in thinking about how the rest of the world may view things. Well, hey, thanks for listening. This is Rev Brad coming to you from the Touchline.